On June 26, 2026, U.S. Central Command announced that American forces had struck Iran after a commercial ship was attacked while transiting one of the most sensitive waterways on Earth. The ship was Me/V Ever Lovely, a Singapore-flagged cargo vessel. According to CENTCOM, it had been exiting the Strait of Hormuz along the Omani coast when it was hit on June 25 by a one-way attack drone. 24 hours later, U.S. aircraft struck Iranian missile and drone storage locations and coastal radar sites. The next day, the crisis widened again. CENTCOM said another one-way drone hit M/T Kiku at 4:30 in the morning Eastern Time, while the Panama-flagged tanker was transiting near the Strait of Hormuz with more than 2 million barrels of crude oil on board. A narrow strip of water had once again forced together shipping, markets, military posture, air defense, surveillance, political risk, and the oldest truth in naval strategy. If the sea lane matters enough, no local incident stays local for long. That is the reason this waterway deserves a patient explanation, rather than a burst of panic. The Strait of Hormuz is not important because it is famous. It is important because it concentrates too many consequences into too little geography. It is the exit gate from the Persian Gulf into the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea. It sits between Iran on one side and Oman on the other. Tankers, container ships, support vessels, patrol craft, and warships all move through a route that matters to energy markets, military planners, insurers, and heads of government at the same time. When traffic there is routine, most people ignore it. When traffic there is threatened, the world remembers very quickly that sea power is not abstract. It is the ability to keep vital movement going while danger is already inside the corridor. The cleanest modern baseline comes from the U.S. Energy Information Administration. EIA says oil flow through the strait averaged 20 million barrels per day in 2024, equal to about 20% of global petroleum liquids consumption. In the first quarter of 2025, total oil flows remained relatively flat compared with 2024. That is the number that should sit in the back of the mind while everything else is discussed. This is not a marginal route. It is one of the core valves of the global energy system. It does not need to close completely to matter. It only needs to look threatened strongly enough that traders, insurers, shippers, governments, and military commanders begin changing behavior at the same time. EIA also offers a useful reminder about how quickly a maritime shock gets translated into market language. After regional tensions rose in June 2025, Brent crude moved from $69 per barrel on June 12 to $74 per barrel on June 13. That does not prove that every incident in Hormuz produces the same price path or the same scale of shock. It proves something more durable. This waterway has become one of the places where military tension is read immediately as economic risk. In practical terms, the strait functions like a pressure gauge for the broader system. The moment the gauge looks unstable, the reaction travels far beyond the Gulf. That market sensitivity has to be understood correctly. Oil prices do not move only because of physical closure. They also move because of doubt. Traders and commercial operators are trying to price the probability of delay, the probability of repeat attack, the probability of insurance increases, the probability of escort requirements, and the probability that a crisis which began with one drone will escalate into something that disrupts tanker schedules for weeks instead of hours. A waterway becomes strategic not only when it is blocked, but when people begin acting as if blockages have become thinkable. That is why the wording in the CENTCOM releases matters so much. On June 26, CENTCOM described the U.S. strikes as a response to aggression against a commercial ship transiting the strait. On June 27, after the second attack, CENTCOM said commercial vessel transits through the Strait of Hormuz continued and that U.S. forces remained vigilant, lethal, and ready. That is a narrow set of official facts, but it tells us a great deal. First, the route was still functioning. Second, Washington wanted the route to keep functioning. Third, military force was already being used to prevent attacks from becoming a new normal. That combination is the essence of chokepoint security under pressure. The route must remain open, yet it stays open only because armed power has already moved into the problem. To understand why the stakes become so high so quickly, it helps to resist the flat map illusion. On a map, the Strait of Hormuz can look like a short connector between larger bodies of water. In reality, It is a controlled passage through which highly valuable traffic must move on predictable tracks. Tankers are not motorcycles slipping through city streets. They are enormous ships with draft inertia, routing constraints, insurance burdens, and schedule dependencies. They are visible. They are economically meaningful. They are hard to reroute around the entire region. Any actor capable of striking them, harassing them, or forcing escorts onto them can create effects that extend far beyond the immediate blast radius of a single incident. That is why naval strategy returns again and again to the idea of the choke point. A choke point is not simply a narrow place. It is a place where geography compresses choices. Commercial traffic has fewer alternate paths. Warships have fewer meaningless movements. Patrol patterns become easier to predict. Defensive burdens increase because every ship that must pass through the corridor is exposed to the same broad categories of danger. Even when the route is open, risk is concentrated. The route becomes a place where presence, surveillance, deterrence, and quick reaction have to be sustained continuously, not improvised after the first warning. That compression creates a special problem for commanders. They are not defending an empty piece of water, they are defending a moving stream of international commerce, while trying to avoid turning every tense contact into a firefight. In a closed training area, a suspicious track can be treated as a technical problem. In the Strait of Hormuz, it is usually a political problem as well. Every contact picture contains neutral traffic, partner traffic, possibly deceptive behavior, and the possibility that a wrong call becomes an international incident before the next watch team even takes the deck. Chokepoint security therefore rewards disciplined command judgment as much as it rewards firepower. This is why the route cannot be understood through oil statistics alone. The waterway matters because it sits at the junction of commerce and coercion. Commercial shipping wants predictability. States that use pressure in the maritime domain want visibility and leverage. Navies are asked to restore predictability without escalating beyond control. Insurance firms want clarity about risk. Markets want reassurance that traffic will keep moving. Energy importers want proof that somebody still owns the burden of route security. Everything in the strait becomes a negotiation between physical movement and political signaling. The immediate incidents in late June 2026 illustrate that perfectly. Neither the June 25th strike on M/V Ever Lovely nor the June 27th strike on M/T Kiku closed the route outright. Yet both incidents carried strategic weight because they demonstrated that commercial shipping could be hit in the corridor, that Washington was willing to answer with military force, and that the entire pattern could repeat even after a first punitive response. Once repetition enters the picture, the crisis stops looking like an isolated event and starts looking like a test of whether safe passage can still be guaranteed on normal commercial terms. Safe passage is one of those phrases that can sound soft until the mechanics are unpacked. In practice, it means surveillance, escort logic, route awareness, watch-standing discipline, communications reliability, legal clarity, intelligence flow, and enough military presence that hostile actors have to calculate against real interception rather than just political statements. It also means commanders have to see trouble early enough to distinguish harassment from attack, and attack from clutter, before the wrong ship takes the wrong damage in the wrong place. That requirement pushes the discussion naturally toward the forces that operate around the strait. The United States does not defend a waterway like Hormuz with one ship and a slogan. It builds a layered system. Sometimes the exact composition in theater changes. That part should never be faked. What matters is the structure of the response. A serious maritime security posture in and around a threatened choke point relies on command and control nodes, surface escorts, airborne warning, replenishment support, intelligence collection, and increasingly dense feeds from unmanned systems. The public often looks for a headline platform. Naval reality is usually a network. Aircraft carriers sit at the center of that network not because every crisis requires immediate strikes from a flight deck, but because carriers bring persistence, command reach, air cover, and political clarity. The Navy fact file says aircraft carriers are the centerpiece of America's naval forces and calls them the most adaptable and survivable airfields in the world. More important than the poetic framing is what the same fact file says they do. Carriers support aircraft that can engage threats to free use of the sea and conduct sustained power projection. They and their strike groups also carry out maritime security operations to interdict threats to merchant shipping and prevent the use of the seas for terrorism and piracy. That is exactly the context in which Hormuz has to be understood. A carrier group is not only a warfighting instrument, it is also a mechanism for organized sea control under tension. The endurance of that mechanism matters. The Navy fact file says Nimitz and Ford-class carriers are the largest warships in the world and are designed for approximately 50 years of service with one midlife refueling. The number is less important than the operational consequence. A carrier is built to remain useful over long periods, and its real value in a chokepoint crisis lies in sustained presence. A ship that can remain in theater, launch aircraft repeatedly, absorb staff functions, and keep doing that day after day changes how everyone around it calculates. Persistence is the actual currency. A force that can stay on station without immediately exhausting itself forces adversaries to measure time differently. But the carrier is only the visible center. The strike group is the working reality. A carrier group brings surface escorts whose job is not to sail nearby for decoration. Guided missile destroyers extend the defensive geometry of the force. The Navy fact file on DDG-51 class destroyers says they provide multi-mission offensive and defensive capabilities and can operate independently or as part of carrier strike groups. It also says they are capable of anti-air warfare, anti-submarine warfare, and anti-surface warfare, and that ships equipped with Aegis Baseline 9 added ballistic missile defense into the strike warfare role. That is exactly the sort of mix a commander wants when a commercial corridor is threatened by missiles, drones, fast surface contacts, and the possibility of wider escalation. The destroyer is important because it turns naval defense from a single platform fantasy into a distributed problem-solving system. The ship carries radar, missile launchers, communications links, helicopters, and trained watch teams. It can operate independently when needed, but in a strike group it becomes part of a larger defensive picture that is far more resilient than any one hull could be on its own. In a chokepoint crisis, that matters because the aim is not to wait until something reaches the carrier or the merchant ship. The aim is to build enough overlapping awareness and defensive reach that hostile behavior is detected, classified, and if necessary engaged before the whole corridor begins to panic. The Aegis combat system is central to that layered defensive picture. Naval describes Aegis as the Navy's most modern surface combat system and says it was designed as a complete system in which the missile launching element, the computer programs, the radar, and the displays are fully integrated to work together. Naval also says Aegis on cruisers and destroyers provides an overlapping architecture to detect, identify, and engage incoming threats. Those two ideas are critical. Integration means that radar, computing, and weapons are not being treated as isolated pieces of hardware. Overlapping architecture means the battle problem is not solved by one sensor and one trigger pull. It is solved by coordinated layers that give the force more than one chance to understand what is incoming and more than one chance to respond. That matters in Hormuz because the threat set is varied. A commander is not only worried about a single conventional missile coming on a clean trajectory. The worry includes one-way attack drones, surface harassment, misleading patterns of movement, possible mining, and the risk that a small tactical incident is actually part of a larger attempt to test response times and rules of engagement. Aegis matters because it helps the escort force process and organize the air defense and surface defense problem as a system rather than a burst of isolated reactions. Airborne warning extends that same logic beyond the horizon. Naval says the E-2D Advanced Hawkeye is the newest variant of the E-2 platform, uses a state-of-the-art radar with a 2-generation leap in capability, and provides broad area coverage. Naval also notes that aerial refueling increases the aircraft's range and persistence. That is exactly what a threatened choke point requires. The central question is not only what a ship can see from its own mast line, it is how far outward the force can push its picture, how long it can keep that picture alive, and how rapidly the information can be turned into decisions that protect both warships and merchant traffic. The E-2D matters because a choke point compresses time. A track that appears at the wrong moment in the wrong place has to be interpreted quickly. A broader, more persistent air and surface picture gives commanders a better chance of seeing patterns before they become surprises. If the watch team can see farther, it has more time to classify. If it has more time to classify, it has more room to avoid either passivity or panic. That is one of the quiet truths of naval power. Better information is not simply about striking sooner, it is also about buying judgment time. Unmanned systems push that logic even further. Nevsant's task force page says TF-59 integrates unmanned systems and artificial intelligence with maritime operations in the 5th Fleet area of operations. That fact alone does not mean unmanned systems solve the Hormuz problem. It means the Navy has already accepted that the watch picture in that region is too large, too cluttered, and too politically sensitive to ignore the value of persistent unmanned sensors. When a corridor carries commercial traffic, fishing traffic, patrol activity, and possible hostile probing at the same time, the force that can maintain the more stable picture gains an enormous advantage before a weapon is ever fired. That is why unmanned systems are not a futuristic side note in this discussion. They are part of the practical answer to a hard geometry problem. A warship is valuable and scarce. A manned helicopter is useful but expensive to sustain. Maritime patrol aircraft can cover distance, but not continuously over every sector that matters. Unmanned surface and aerial systems add persistence. They can remain present, extend coverage, relay data, and keep feeding a command picture that helps human watch teams distinguish routine movement from something that deserves immediate attention. In a place like Hormuz, the ability to keep watching is itself a form of power. Still, sensors and radars only matter if the force can remain supplied. This is where the strategic conversation often gets thin. People want to discuss missiles and drones, but skip the ships that make tomorrow possible. NAVCA's replenishment oiler material is useful here because it states the problem plainly. The John Lewis-class ships provide underway replenishment of fuel and stores to Navy ships at sea and jet fuel for aircraft assigned to aircraft carriers. That one sentence explains why chokepoint security is never just about combat. It is also about endurance. Aircraft burn fuel. Escorts burn fuel. Crews consume food and water. Parts wear out. If the route stays tense for long enough, logistics becomes part of the battle even before a major exchange begins. Underway replenishment is one of the least glamorous and most decisive things a Navy does. A strike group that cannot refuel, rearm, and sustain itself becomes a headline platform rather than a lasting military fact. In a long crisis, the combat logistics force is what turns presence into duration. Hormuz is exactly the kind of place where duration matters, because repeated incidents create pressure for a force to remain on station long enough to reassure commerce, deter further attacks, and give policymakers room to decide what they are willing to do next. This is also why a chokepoint crisis is a command problem before it is a gunnery problem. Commanders must synchronize many clocks at once. There is the commercial clock, because tankers and merchant vessels must keep moving. There is the air defense clock, because incoming tracks shrink decision time quickly. There is the logistics clock, because ships and aircraft cannot operate forever on initial stores. There is the legal clock, because classification and response rules matter in crowded international waters. There is the political clock, because each action is judged not only tactically but diplomatically. A force that can manage those clocks together is far more dangerous and far more useful than a force that can simply shoot hard once. That complexity is what makes the late June 2026 incidents so important. They did not simply show that violence is possible near the strait. That has been obvious for years. They showed that commercial traffic can be struck, that the United States will use force in response, that the route may continue operating while violence is already inside it, and that the crisis can repeat even after a punitive action has already occurred. That sequence is the signature of a chokepoint entering a new phase of instability. The route is not closed, but it is no longer resting on ordinary commercial confidence either. The difference between ordinary commercial confidence and militarized confidence is worth slowing down for. Ordinary confidence means ship owners, insurers, and crews believe the route is risky only within the normal tolerances of global shipping. Militarized confidence means the route remains open because a powerful navy is actively helping hold it open. That shift matters strategically. Once a corridor needs visible armed protection to keep functioning at scale, the protecting power inherits a new burden. It must now decide how long to maintain the posture, how much risk to absorb, how broadly to define aggression, and how to signal firmness without accidentally normalizing a permanent crisis state. That burden can be politically expensive even when the protecting power succeeds. If the U.S. Navy keeps traffic moving, many commercial actors will quietly adapt by assuming that American protection is part of the route's operating environment. That reduces immediate panic but increases long-term expectation. It becomes harder to scale down later because any visible reduction in protection can be interpreted by markets and partners as weakness or doubt. Success can therefore create its own trap. The corridor looks stable, but only because someone has accepted the cost of keeping it that way. The alternative is not cheap either. If Washington visibly reduces its role while attacks or credible threats continue, the commercial signal may be harsh. Insurers can reprice. Traders can hedge more aggressively. Freight planners can build in delay. Energy importers can look for diplomatic reassurance elsewhere. Domestic political systems in importing countries can start asking whether the route is still secure in any meaningful sense. A choke point therefore punishes both overreaction and underreaction. More force raises exposure, less visible force raises fear. The operational art lies in sustaining enough control that the route functions without making every day look like the opening of a larger war. This is why shipping incidents in Hormuz travel so fast into domestic politics. Energy routes are remote from most people's daily lives until they stop being remote. The chain is straightforward. Tension raises fear. Fear raises prices and insurance costs. Those changes affect freight and fuel. Fuel and freight affect everything that depends on moving goods at scale. By the time the public starts talking about the crisis, the system has often been reacting for days. A government that understands this does not wait for a formal closure declaration. It starts trying to preserve confidence much earlier because confidence is one of the things actually being fought over. That confidence has a military dimension as well. Merchant captains, shipping companies, and partner states want to know whether route security is real or symbolic. Real security does not mean danger disappears. It means there is a functioning command picture, an escort logic if needed, layered defensive capacity, and a visible willingness to answer attacks. Symbolic security means speeches without enough steel and aviation behind them to shape behavior. The late June 2026 CENTCOM releases matter precisely because they signaled that the answer was not purely rhetorical. Military force had already been committed to keeping commercial aggression from becoming a new accepted condition. The Strait therefore reveals something basic about sea power. Sea power is not merely the capacity to destroy. It is the capacity to organize movement under danger. A navy proves its worth not only when it sinks something, but when it keeps the corridor usable for everyone who depends on it. That includes allied states, neutral shipping, commodity markets, and the domestic economies that experience maritime risk first as a number at the pump or a rise in freight costs. In that sense, Hormuz is not a side theater. It is one of the places where the military and commercial meanings of the sea are forced together most clearly. This is also why the most useful explanations avoid turning the problem into a single duel between Iran and a U.S. carrier. The real picture is broader. Coastal surveillance, drones, radar, escorts, command posts, merchant traffic, replenishment ships, insurance markets, and political signaling are all interacting at once. The carrier strike group is important because it can operate across many of those layers at the same time. The escort destroyers are important because they turn warning into defense. Airborne early warning matters because it stretches time. Logistics matter because they keep the whole system alive after the first week. Unmanned systems matter because they thicken the watch picture in a region where human attention alone is not enough. A threatened choke point also exposes the importance of restraint. A powerful force in a crowded corridor must avoid two opposite failures. One is hesitation so severe that aggressors learn the route can be probed almost without cost. The other is overconfidence so severe that every suspicious movement is treated as a lawful target before the facts are sorted. Hormuz is not only dangerous because weapons exist, It is dangerous because so much mixed traffic shares the same space. The commander who protects the route has to be faster than the adversary without becoming sloppier than the situation can tolerate. That challenge becomes harder the longer a crisis lasts. Watch teams tire, ships consume stores, patterns become predictable, adversaries study routines. Commercial actors ask for clearer guarantees. Politicians demand outcomes on a faster schedule than the ocean likes to provide. In that environment, a good naval system is one that keeps creating decision space instead of losing it. That is what the layered force around a choke point is really for. It buys time. It broadens awareness. It reduces the chance that one blip on a radar scope becomes the only fact available when a commander has to choose. The implication for the future is sobering. Drone attacks on shipping are not spectacular because they are technologically perfect. They are dangerous because they are comparatively cheap ways to create high-value uncertainty. The defending Navy may spend far more money, time, and operational attention keeping the route open than the attacker spends trying to destabilize it. That is one reason the Navy's interest in directed energy and unmanned surveillance matters here. If the attack side relies on repeated low-cost systems, the defense side has to search for more sustainable ways to keep watch and absorb pressure without burning through high-end interceptors and human endurance at the first wave. Helios sits inside that search. The official Navy fact sheet on the high-energy laser with integrated optical dazzler and surveillance system makes clear that the service treats directed energy as a real part of future surface defense rather than a laboratory curiosity. In a place like Hormuz, the attraction is obvious. A defending force wants more tools for dealing with drones and other low-cost threats without making every intercept an expensive exchange. It also wants those tools integrated into the wider combat system rather than bolted on as isolated experiments. That does not mean lasers erase the problem. It means the Navy is trying to change the economics of defense before cheap attack systems dictate the whole tempo. The same logic explains why unmanned systems and artificial intelligence are being pushed so hard through TF-59. A corridor like Hormuz is full of movement that matters, but not all of it matters equally. The force that can keep sorting routine traffic from threatening traffic faster and more reliably gains a decisive advantage. Persistent unmanned systems can help build that recognized maritime picture. Artificial intelligence can help flag anomalies and manage data flow. Human commanders still decide. The point is to give them a wider and more stable picture so that their decisions are informed earlier and under less stress. There is also a deep alliance dimension here. Many of the states most exposed to Gulf energy flows are not the states that patrol the waterway most heavily. That gap creates expectation. Asian importers, European partners, Gulf governments, and global shipping firms all watch U.S. maritime posture because they know the strait's stability is linked to broader confidence in American willingness and ability to keep major sea lanes functioning. This does not mean everyone wants the same policy. It means everyone is watching the same corridor for proof about who can actually sustain order there. That is why the question is never just whether the Strait of Hormuz is open today. The more serious question is what kind of opening it currently has. Is it commercially normal? Is it commercially nervous but still self-sustaining? Is it open because warships are actively organizing safe passage? Is it open but only under a pattern of repeated retaliation and elevated insurance? Those are very different conditions, even if ships continue moving in all of them. In late June 2026, the official record pointed clearly toward the third and fourth categories. Traffic continued, but it continued inside an armed contest that was already shaping military posture and market behavior. That difference should shape how the crisis is discussed. A route can remain open and still be strategically unstable. It can remain open and still impose significant cost. It can remain open and still demand heavier maritime security burdens from the protecting power. Closure is not the only threshold that matters. Repeated successful attacks on commercial shipping, even without full stoppage, can still force major changes in naval operations and commercial calculations. Hormuz is important precisely because it translates partial disorder into broad consequences. If there is one mistake worth avoiding, it is the habit of treating choke points as special only during headline weeks. In reality, their importance comes from the constant structure beneath the headlines. The waterway matters on quiet days because trade depends on it. It matters on tense days because military planners know trade depends on it. And it matters on violent days because every missile, drone, escort, and insurance adjustment is really a fight over whether one of the core roots of modern industrial life will still function on ordinary terms. Once that perspective is clear, the Strait stops looking like a distant geography lesson and starts looking like a recurring test of how maritime order is actually maintained. That is why the late June 2026 incidents should not be remembered only as an exchange of strikes. They should be remembered as a reminder of what a choke point really is. It is a place where geography compresses global dependence into a narrow channel, where cheap attacks can create expensive doubt, where navies are asked to defend commerce without losing control of escalation, and where persistence matters more than drama. The official CENTCOM releases tell us violence entered the corridor. The EIA data tells us why the corridor matters. The Navy and DEVI fact sheets tell us what kind of layered force is built to answer that kind of problem. Put together, they tell a clear story. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a place on the map, it is one of the clearest demonstrations in the modern world that sea power still decides whether the global system moves calmly, moves nervously, or fails to move at all. There is another reason that sea power matters so much in this corridor, and it has to do with the difference between striking a ship and governing a route. Striking one ship is easy to imagine. Governing a route is harder. Governance at sea means knowing who is moving, where they are moving, what pattern is normal for that ship class, what pattern is unusual, which warnings are credible, which warnings are bluffs, how to escort without crowding traffic, how to respond without hitting the wrong target, and how to keep doing all of that while the rest of the world watches the market reaction in real time. In other words, Chokepoint security is not just a tactical exercise, it is a form of maritime administration carried out under armed pressure. That administrative side of naval power is often invisible because it produces dull successes rather than dramatic footage. A tanker completes a transit, a merchant ship reports no incident, an insurer does not yet push rates into panic territory, a market calms slightly because traffic volumes have not collapsed. None of those outcomes make for a triumphant image. Yet they are exactly the outcomes that determine whether a crisis remains bounded or turns into a broader economic and political emergency. A good navy often looks unremarkable on a good day for the simple reason that it has prevented several bad days from arriving at once. The mention of mine layer capabilities in the June 27 CENTCOM release deserves special attention for this reason. Mines occupy a special place in naval strategy because they are cheap compared with the cost of the ships they threaten, difficult to clear quickly, and politically useful to anyone trying to create persistent uncertainty. A missile or a drone produces a visible event. A mine can produce a zone of hesitation. That hesitation may slow traffic long before a definitive clearance picture exists. Once mine risk enters the conversation, the burden on the protecting Navy grows immediately, because clearing, verifying, and reopening a route safely is much slower than announcing that the route must remain open. That time imbalance is one of the most cruel features of chokepoint warfare. Disruption can be fast, reassurance is slow, an attack can happen in minutes. The proof that shipping is once again safe may take days, weeks, or longer, depending on what kind of threat the defender thinks may still be present. Even in a corridor where traffic never stops completely, the mere suspicion that mines could be involved changes how captains, insurers, and commanders behave. Routes are adjusted, speeds change, escort logic changes, helicopters and unmanned systems are tasked differently. The route remains open, but it no longer functions with ordinary confidence. This helps explain why a waterway can remain technically open while being strategically degraded. Ships may still move, cargo may still be delivered, but if every transit now requires a larger protective screen, higher insurance, tighter timing, more radio coordination, and more military overhead, then the corridor has already become more expensive and more brittle. The value of sea control lies in preventing that brittleness from hardening into a permanent new condition. That is why even limited incidents in Hormuz have consequences well beyond the physical damage done to the ship that was actually struck. There is also the question of traffic discipline. Commercial masters moving through a tense corridor want clarity. They want to know whether warships are merely present somewhere in theater or actually organized around safe passage. They want predictable reporting chains, useful warnings, and enough consistency that they can brief their crews with something stronger than rumor. In that sense, maritime security is partly a communications mission. A warship that cannot communicate clearly with commercial traffic is not just less helpful, it can become part of the confusion that the defender is trying to reduce. That communication burden is heavier in Hormuz than in an isolated military operating area because commercial shipping is not an accessory to the story. It is the reason the story matters. The route is not being defended for symbolic reasons. It is being defended because the surrounding economies and energy systems depend on ships continuing to move through it. Once that is understood, naval presence looks different. The warship is not just a weapon platform. It is also a moving guarantor whose value is measured partly by whether other ships believe the guarantee. Belief matters because commercial routing decisions are made before the ship reaches the most dangerous point. A firm may choose to delay a sailing, reroute a support vessel, split cargo exposure, raise premiums, or seek additional escort guarantees based on perception alone. This is why the market effect of a chokepoint crisis often arrives before any formal declaration that the route is blocked. Operators are responding to the possibility of friction, not waiting for certainty. By the time certainty exists, much of the economic adaptation has already begun. From a naval perspective, this means time has two different meanings. Tactical time is the time measured in detection, classification, engagement, and immediate reaction. Strategic time is the time measured in shipping schedules, insurance cycles, reserve inventories, alliance consultations, and political patience. A force operating in Hormuz has to manage both clocks. It can win tactically and still lose strategically if the corridor becomes so tense that commercial actors treat it as semi-denied water. It can also preserve strategic confidence only if its tactical performance is disciplined enough to make reassurance believable. The escort burden illustrates this perfectly. Escort sounds straightforward until the actual work is imagined. A merchant ship has to be identified, timed, and placed inside a broader route security pattern. Escorts need to preserve enough spacing to maneuver, enough awareness to react, and enough communications discipline to remain useful, rather than obstructive. Air cover or airborne warning may need to look farther ahead. Other warships must continue broader patrol work. Logistic ships still have to support the force. Nothing about this is solved by declaring that escorts exist. The burden grows with every additional transit that now requires visible military attention. That burden can become cumulative in a way that outsiders underestimate. One tense day is manageable. Several tense weeks begin to alter maintenance patterns, crew fatigue, sortie planning, and replenishment cycles. A chokepoint crisis therefore attacks endurance as much as nerves. The defending Navy has to show not only that it can surge into the corridor, but that it can remain effective after the first surge is over and the public attention starts drifting elsewhere. Endurance, once again, is the real measure of seriousness. This is why the replenishment discussion cannot be separated from the tactical discussion. Every extra day of high-alert operations in and around Hormuz consumes fuel, aviation hours, spare parts, munitions readiness, and human alertness. A crisis in a corridor can therefore create a logistics contest, even if the headline reporting talks only about strikes and escorts. The side that can sustain organized presence longer holds the advantage. That principle is ancient, but the modern energy market makes it more visible because the world begins reacting to endurance almost immediately. There is also a larger regional point. The Strait of Hormuz is not just important because traffic moves through it. It is important because there are few elegant substitutes for moving the same volume elsewhere on short notice. Some cargo can be redirected, some pipeline capacity can reduce exposure for certain exporters, and some states can draw more heavily on inventories for a time. But those are mitigation tools, not magic exits from geography. The strategic meaning of the strait remains because a very large volume of economically important movement is still tied to the corridor. Every actor in the region knows that. Every major outside consumer knows it too. That lack of elegant substitutes is what gives coercive pressure such leverage. An actor does not have to conquer a whole sea to matter. It only has to create enough credible friction inside the key outlet that everyone upstream starts recalculating. That is why choke points occupy so much strategic attention. They allow comparatively local actions to produce disproportionate international consequences. The power of the place lies in leverage, not simply in size. Leverage also shapes the psychology of retaliation. When Washington responds militarily to attacks on commercial shipping near Hormuz, it is not only punishing a specific event, it is also trying to restore the credibility of a larger rule, that the route cannot be allowed to slide into a tolerated pattern of armed interference. But restoring credibility is harder than announcing it. If the first response is followed by a second commercial strike, as CENTCOM said happened with M/T Kiku on June 27, then the protecting power faces a familiar dilemma: escalate more and absorb greater regional risk, or tolerate the appearance that the first punishment failed to reset behavior. Chokepoints force that dilemma faster than most other environments because each new incident immediately reopens the question of whether traffic is still truly safe. This is where naval posture and political posture meet most clearly. A strike group, escort force, and surveillance network can keep pressure on the tactical problem. They cannot remove political ambiguity by themselves. Political leaders still have to decide what counts as restoration, what counts as escalation, and how much repeated force the route stability is worth. The Navy can buy options and keep the corridor functioning while those decisions are made. It cannot make the political trade-offs disappear. In that sense, maritime power is indispensable but not self-sufficient. It creates usable choices. It does not spare leaders from choosing. The same is true for the side applying pressure. Harassing shipping in or near Hormuz is attractive precisely because it forces large powers to spend attention and resources on a route that has no cheap replacement. But that pressure has limits. Once attacks on commercial traffic become too direct or too frequent, the risk of wider retaliation grows. The choke point offers leverage, but it also concentrates accountability. That is another reason these crises can move quickly. The geography that gives an attacker influence also gives the defender a clear argument about why intervention is necessary. An additional difficulty is that the operational environment is not static from dawn to dusk. Weather shifts, traffic density shifts, civilian reporting quality shifts. Crews rotate, intelligence gets updated. A watch team that felt comfortable with the picture at sunrise may be handling a much more ambiguous picture by sunset. This is why persistent systems matter so much. Airborne warning, destroyer radar, unmanned surface surveillance, and organized reporting from the broader force all help stabilize what would otherwise be a fragile human picture under strain. The defender is trying to create continuity across a moving target set. That continuity is one reason the E-2D matters so much in the wider architecture. A state-of-the-art radar with more range and persistence is not just a hardware improvement. It changes how quickly a force can recognize that something is unusual, how early it can hand information into the rest of the network, and how much tactical time it can preserve before a surface commander is forced into a harder choice. In a narrow and busy corridor, extra time is often the difference between informed restraint and rushed reaction. The same can be said for unmanned systems under TF-59. Their importance is not that they make human operators irrelevant. Their importance is that they can keep occupying parts of the picture that would otherwise go unobserved for long stretches or would require costly manned coverage. In a theater where small changes in movement pattern may carry strategic meaning, persistence becomes its own kind of sensor. A system that keeps watching can notice routine. Once routine is understood, anomaly begins to stand out. That is the foundation of useful maritime security. Useful maritime security also depends on legal and professional restraint. Mixed traffic means the defender cannot simply treat every fast movement or every unusual turn as a hostile act. The corridor contains neutral shipping, local traffic, and behavior that may look odd without being aggressive. A protecting force therefore needs enough confidence in its picture to respond firmly when necessary without becoming the source of overreaction itself. That requirement makes professionalism part of deterrence. Merchant shipping must believe that the warships guarding the route are not only armed but disciplined. All of this explains why the Strait of Hormuz remains one of the clearest tests of modern naval competence. It is not enough to have missiles, aircraft, or big ships. A force has to integrate all of that into a sustained operating system under political and commercial pressure. It has to preserve movement, read ambiguity, absorb repeated strain, and create enough confidence that the global system continues to function while violence has already entered the corridor. That is an extraordinarily demanding standard. Very few waterways expose the standards so brutally or so publicly. For that reason alone, the strait deserves to be discussed as a structural problem, rather than a periodic headline. The attacks in late June 2026 mattered because they reminded the world that the corridor can still be contested directly. The EIA numbers matter because they show how much of the global system still depends on the route. The Navy and NVCA material matter because they show what kind of layered force is intended to keep such a route functioning under threat. None of those pieces alone explains the whole picture. Together they show the harder truth. A narrow waterway can force enormous powers into sustained commitments because the cost of letting it drift into disorder is higher than the cost of staying engaged. That is the real meaning of Hormuz. It is a place where the map is small, the consequences are large, and the burden of order falls on whoever can combine surveillance, escort power, logistics, command discipline, and political patience for longer than everyone else. The corridor does not need to become a full war zone to alter world behavior. It only needs to become uncertain enough that every ship, market, and capital city begins asking the same question at once: who still controls movement here? As long as that question remains open, the strait will remain one of the most dangerous and important waterways on Earth. There is value in spelling out what a partial loss of control would actually look like, because many people imagine only two end states. Either the route is open and normal, or the route is closed and dramatic. Real maritime crises are rarely that clean. A route can remain physically open while becoming operationally hostile. It can remain open while traffic slows, while insurance rises, while tanker owners demand more certainty, while naval escorts consume more fuel and attention, and while governments begin quietly drawing more heavily on inventories because they no longer trust the corridor to remain routine. The decisive transition is often not from open to shut, it is from normal to managed. Managed movement is expensive movement. A ship owner can live with ordinary risk. What hurts is the accumulation of extraordinary precautions. Additional communications reporting, extra route discipline, higher war risk premiums, altered crew expectations, uncertain arrival windows, and a growing dependency on visible military cover all increase cost even if not a single tanker is fully prevented from crossing the strait. That cost then ripples outward. Refiners lose some scheduling flexibility. Traders must hedge against a less reliable route. Importing states start asking whether their existing buffers are enough. None of this requires cinematic closure. It only requires confidence to weaken. Weakening confidence is one of the most efficient effects an attacker can buy in a choke point. A drone does not need to sink a large percentage of traffic to matter. It only needs to prove that attacks are possible inside the corridor, and that the defender now has to work much harder to guarantee normal movement. That is why the word normal matters so much in maritime strategy. Sea control is not simply the ability to place a warship in the area. It is the ability to keep a route functioning in a way that allows the commercial system to keep trusting it. Once trust weakens, sea control becomes more expensive to demonstrate every day. That is also why a protecting navy cannot think only in terms of retaliation. Punishment matters. If attacks on merchant traffic go unanswered, the route will almost certainly become more unstable. But retaliation alone is not the same thing as route management. Even after a successful punitive strike, the defender still has to answer more practical questions. Who is monitoring merchant traffic tonight? Which sectors have the best awareness? Which ships need closer coordination? What is the status of the wider air picture? What signs would indicate that harassment is shifting toward mining? Which replenishment evolutions can be completed without reducing escort density too sharply? A choke point forces the defender to live in logistics and command detail long after the public story has moved on to a simpler debate about whether force was used. Consider the escort problem in slow motion. A commercial vessel entering a tense corridor does not merely need a warship somewhere in the same sea. It needs a route environment shaped by prior work. The watch picture must already be built. The escorting force must know the broad traffic pattern. Communications links must already be tested. Helicopter or airborne warning support must be taskable if needed. Fuel states of the protecting ships matter because no escort plan is meaningful if the escort itself is about to disappear for replenishment. Even the public pace of updates matters, because merchant firms and governments draw conclusions from whether the protecting power sounds organized or improvised. That last point is often neglected. In maritime security crises, rhetoric is part of command. Public statements do not replace steel, but they shape how markets and partners interpret steel. If official language suggests calm and continuity while ships continue to move, that can help preserve confidence. If official language becomes confused, contradictory, or visibly behind events, uncertainty deepens even if the underlying force posture is still strong. In other words, the route is stabilized not only by what the Navy can do, but by whether others believe it can keep doing it tomorrow. This is another reason why command and control aircraft and networked combat systems matter so much. A destroyer with Aegis is valuable because it can help structure the immediate defense problem. An E-2D is valuable because it can extend the picture and give commanders more time. Unmanned systems are valuable because they can keep feeding observations into the broader recognized maritime picture. But the real strength appears only when the information from those layers becomes something the force can use coherently. A larger picture without coherence is just noise at scale. Hormuz punishes noise because confusion in a crowded corridor costs real ships real time. The route therefore teaches an old lesson in a modern form. Maritime power depends on organization more than spectacle. The carrier, destroyers, warning aircraft, unmanned systems, and replenishment ships do not matter separately. They matter because they form a disciplined structure that can keep answering the same question over and over. What is moving through the corridor? What threatens it? And what has to be done now so movement continues tomorrow? Every successful day in a tense choke point is the result of that structure working again. That structure also has to absorb deception. An adversary trying to create instability rarely announces its full method in advance. The pressure may come from one-way drones. It may come from suggestive ship movements. It may come from broader surveillance designed to study patterns. It may come from an effort to make every defensive response consume more fuel, more crew attention, and more high-end interceptors than the attacker spends. This is one reason route defense can feel unfair. The defending power is protecting everything that must pass through. The attacker is looking only for openings, costs, and hesitation. Because the attacker's math is often asymmetrical, the defender has to think economically as well as tactically. High-end missiles, crew endurance, flight hours, and deployment availability are not infinite. If every low-cost threat draws a premium response, the corridor becomes a mechanism for draining the defending Navy over time. That is exactly why the Navy's interest in better unmanned surveillance, more integrated command systems, and future directed energy defense is strategically important. The service is trying to reduce the mismatch between cheap disruption and expensive protection. Hormuz is one of the places where that mismatch is easiest to see. There is a broader historical pattern here. Major maritime powers have always worried about narrow passages, not because narrow passages are mystical, but because they compress both traffic and attention. Whoever must protect the passage has to remain alert continuously. Whoever wants to threaten the passage can choose moments. That asymmetry never disappears. Technology changes it, and training can narrow it, but the basic shape remains. A choke point forces the Guardian into a permanent posture of disciplined readiness. The Challenger only needs occasional opportunities to create headlines, fear, and cost. For commercial shipping, this means the meaning of safe passage is never purely legal. It is practical. Captains and companies need to know whether the route is passable with confidence, passable with military dependence, or passable only in a narrow technical sense that still leaves them exposed to unacceptable uncertainty. Those distinctions matter in charter decisions, fuel planning, crewing expectations, and contractual risk. The naval commander may be thinking in terms of surveillance sectors and escort geometry. The ship owner may be thinking in terms of deadlines and liability. Both are responding to the same corridor, but through very different institutions. That institutional difference helps explain why chokepoint crises can feel politically distorted. Military planners may judge a situation manageable because the force posture is sufficient and traffic is still moving. Commercial actors may judge the same situation dangerous because the cost of being wrong is catastrophic for a single ship and its cargo. Politicians then absorb both messages at once. The route is open, yet it feels precarious. The force is in place, yet the market is nervous. The challenge for statecraft is to keep those perspectives aligned enough that the route does not become a self-fulfilling crisis. Self-fulfilling crises are common in maritime commerce because expectation changes behavior so quickly. If enough firms believe future transit will be harder, they adjust now. If enough insurers believe future loss probability has increased, they price now. If enough governments believe the route may become unreliable, they begin contingency discussions now. Those adjustments can worsen the strain on the system, even without a formal blockade. Delays compound, congestion shifts elsewhere, inventories become more valuable. Political leaders start making statements to calm markets, and those statements themselves become evidence that the system is under pressure. The corridor therefore generates feedback loops as well as direct threat. Hormuz is one of the clearest modern examples of those feedback loops because of how central energy remains to industrial economies. Fuel is not just another commodity. It sits inside transportation, agriculture, industry, logistics, and household budgets. That is why even modest price movements linked to regional tension attract so much attention. EIA's example of Brent moving from $69 to $74 in a day is useful not because $5 settles the strategic debate, but because it shows the speed with which market sensitivity appears. The strait acts as a trigger point for fear, and fear itself has economic force. If attacks continued in a repeated pattern, a protecting navy would likely face a more structured escort and surveillance burden. That would mean more routine safe passage coordination, more effort to preserve broader awareness beyond the immediate transit window, and greater emphasis on detecting preparatory behavior before it becomes a strike. In plain language, the Navy would be trying to move the fight backward in time. It would want to understand the threat before the merchant ship reaches the most vulnerable part of the corridor, not afterward. The value of better sensing and longer persistence lies precisely there. The trouble is that moving the fight backward in time also raises the standard for evidence. What looked ordinary yesterday may look threatening today only when connected to some new pattern. That is why command discipline becomes even more valuable as technology improves. The force may have more data, more feeds, and more persistence than before, but the burden of lawful and strategically sound judgment does not shrink. In a corridor crowded with neutral traffic, extra sensing does not eliminate ambiguity, it only changes its shape. This is one of the reasons destroyers remain indispensable even as the Navy experiments with more unmanned systems. The DDG-51 fact file is useful not only because it lists anti-air, anti-submarine, and anti-surface roles. It is useful because it reminds us that the escort ship remains a flexible, multi-mission human command platform in the middle of the problem. The destroyer is not only a launcher, it is a decision point. Its crew integrates radar, communications, aviation, tactical doctrine, and bridge judgment inside the same hull. In a tense choke point, that fusion of capability and judgment is hard to replace. The same point can be made about the carrier in a different way. Carriers are often described only in terms of strike power, but in Hormuz the more interesting contribution may be sustained operational support to the wider theater picture. The carrier air wing, the command spaces, the communications architecture, and the sheer endurance of the platform all help support a prolonged maritime security posture. The carrier is therefore not only a sword. It is also a way to keep the broader system of surveillance, signaling, and regional flexibility alive over time. None of this makes the corridor invulnerable. It makes the corridor governable under pressure if enough capability is committed and managed well. That distinction matters. The sea cannot be made perfectly safe, especially in a region where state competition and asymmetric methods overlap. The real objective is to keep the route usable enough that the wider system does not begin making extreme adjustments in advance of the facts. Maritime power succeeds when it reduces the gap between danger and confidence enough for trade to keep moving. That brings the discussion back to the underlying military purpose of being present in the first place. Presence is not just about being seen. It is about changing the choices available to everyone else. A merchant ship captain who knows there is organized safe passage support available behaves differently. An insurer who sees disciplined military continuity may price differently. A hostile planner who expects overlapping surveillance, Aegis-backed escorts, and persistent unmanned watch coverage must design a more complicated operation. A politician deciding whether to escalate must account for the fact that the route is not undefended open water. Presence changes decision space. That is why it is valuable. If the waterway were strategically trivial, none of this machinery would be justified. The fact that it is justified tells its own story. 20 million barrels a day moving through one corridor is enough to command military attention, economic analysis, diplomatic signaling, and public anxiety all at once. A route carrying that kind of consequence will always attract both protectors and challengers. The only real question is whether the protecting side can stay coherent long enough that the challengers fail to redefine normal. That, more than anything, is the contest underway whenever Hormuz enters crisis headlines. It is a contest over normality. Is normal commercial movement still the dominant condition, with the attacks treated as unacceptable disruptions that must be suppressed? Or has armed pressure become persistent enough that militarized transit is now the accepted baseline? Once the second condition takes hold, the route is still open in one sense and already damaged in another. The entire burden of naval power in the corridor is to prevent that damaged condition from hardening into the new rule. So when the Strait of Hormuz is described as one of the most dangerous waterways in the world, the most useful response is not awe, it is precision. Dangerous in what way? Dangerous because a narrow passage connects one of the world's biggest energy export regions to the wider sea. Dangerous because commercial ships cannot simply wish geography away. Dangerous because cheap attacks can trigger expensive responses. Dangerous because reassurance takes longer than disruption. Dangerous because global markets are fast, while mines, escorts, and replenishment are slow, physical problems. Dangerous because the corridor exposes whether major naval powers can still combine military force and commercial protection without letting the crisis spiral into something even larger. That is why one waterway can control so much more than water. It controls timing. It controls cost. It controls whether confidence survives first contact with fear. It controls whether a local attack remains local or becomes a test of the broader international system. And in the end, that is what the Strait of Hormuz really is, a narrow corridor where steel, oil, command judgment, and global dependence all pass each other at close range, and where the meaning of naval power is measured not by the size of a ship alone, but by whether movement through the corridor still feels governable when the shooting starts. There is still another lesson in the strait, and it concerns what navies are actually for in an interdependent world. It is common to talk about fleets as if they exist only for major war. Major war is obviously one of their reasons for existing, but Hormuz shows the broader truth. A navy also exists to preserve the conditions under which trade, alliance commitments, industrial planning, and political freedom of action remain possible before general war begins. If the corridor becomes too dangerous to trust, states lose freedom of action immediately. They start making decisions in the shadow of energy pressure and market fear. A route that stays open under disciplined protection preserves room for politics. A route that slides into recurring disorder narrows that room brutally. This is why carriers, destroyers, warning aircraft, and logistic ships are relevant even to people who never intend to learn ship classes or tactical jargon. These systems are the machinery behind strategic breathing room. They help prevent the world from moving overnight from manageable tension to panicked adaptation. They do not make risk disappear. They keep risk from becoming the only fact that matters. When a protecting navy succeeds in Hormuz, what it often preserves is not a dramatic victory tableau. It is the continued possibility of ordinary planning by everyone else who depends on the corridor. Ordinary planning is more valuable than it sounds. An importer deciding cargo allocations, a refinery planning feedstock, an insurer evaluating exposure, an allied government making diplomatic commitments, and a shipping firm setting schedules all depend on some baseline expectation about the sea. They do not need the sea to be perfectly safe. They need it to remain governable enough that decisions can be made on economic logic rather than on fear alone. Once fear becomes the dominant variable, every downstream institution begins protecting itself by adding caution, cost, and delay. That is how a maritime crisis spreads far beyond the splash point of the original attack. For the protecting navy, that means success is measured partly by the absence of secondary panic. Have traffic patterns remained credible? Have the commercial actors who depend on the route continued behaving as though the route is usable? Have insurers, importers, and partner governments concluded that someone still owns the burden of stability? These are not glamorous measures of combat effectiveness, yet they are central to what sea control means in a corridor like Hormuz. The Navy is not only defending itself, it is defending the wider belief that movement can continue. That belief is fragile because the corridor is so visible. A threat to a minor sea lane may be serious without dominating global attention. Hormuz is different. It has become a symbolic shorthand for the vulnerability of energy markets and the vulnerability of maritime commerce to regional violence. That symbolism magnifies every incident. The military significance of a strike matters, the commercial meaning of the strike matters as well. But the symbolic value may matter almost as much, because it shapes how fast fear travels through media, politics, and markets. In this way, the Strait is not only a physical corridor, it is an information corridor. The information side of the crisis is one reason public proof of vigilance matters. CENTCOM's emphasis that transits continued and that U.S. forces remained present, vigilant, and ready was not filler language. It was part of the stabilization effort. The route had to be described not as abandoned water, but as watched water. A watched corridor is still dangerous. An unwatched corridor is something worse. It is an invitation for the rest of the system to assume that protection is reactive, uncertain, or already overwhelmed. Official language cannot substitute for capability, but it can help convey whether capability is organized. This is also where allied and partner perceptions become strategically important. The states that rely on the Gulf for exports or imports are not passive spectators. They draw conclusions from how quickly the route is defended, how clearly commercial security is described, and how long an outside power appears willing to bear the cost of visible maritime protection. Those conclusions can influence everything from energy diplomacy to defense cooperation to hedging behavior. In that sense, each successful transit through Hormuz during a crisis is not only a commercial event, it is a political signal broadcast to a wide audience. The opposite signal is equally powerful. If repeated attacks create the impression that the route is open only by luck, then even a technically functioning corridor can begin losing political credibility. States and firms may continue using it because they must, not because they trust it. That is a dangerous condition. Traffic still flows, but confidence is now coerced rather than voluntary. A protecting Navy has not fully failed in that situation, but it has not fully succeeded either. It has prevented stoppage without restoring ease. Hormuz often lives in that gray zone, and the gray zone is where the hardest strategic work is done. This is why the Strait also teaches humility. No matter how powerful the fleet, no navy can make a commercially vital corridor completely frictionless once determined attackers begin testing it. The ocean is too large, mixed traffic is too dense, the legal picture is too complex, and the economics of disruption are too favorable to the side seeking cheap leverage. What a strong navy can do is keep the friction below the threshold at which the wider system starts breaking its own patterns in response. That is still an extraordinary achievement. It just looks less cinematic than most public discussions of power. In practical terms, the burden falls on disciplined routines. Watchstanders track, airborne warning extends the picture. Escorts hold the line, unmanned systems keep feeding data. Replenishment ships make tomorrow possible. Staffs update the recognized maritime picture. Commercial traffic is coordinated as carefully as the situation requires. Each piece can sound ordinary in isolation. Together they form the architecture that keeps the corridor from becoming a self-sustaining emergency. The route remains usable because a great deal of professional repetition is happening correctly out of public view. That professional repetition is easy to underrate because it does not feel dramatic until it fails. The easiest way to appreciate it is to imagine its absence. No reliable warning picture, no integrated surface defense, no persistent watch layer, no replenishment support, no practiced escort logic, no coherent statement that safe passage is being supported. Under those conditions, even a handful of incidents can force much larger commercial reactions. In that sense, the best proof of naval competence in Hormuz is often not a spectacular destruction clip. It is the fact that the route, under pressure, remains more orderly than it has any right to be. That brings the whole problem back to first principles. Geography gave the Strait leverage. Energy dependence gave it consequence. Modern sensors, destroyers, carriers, and command systems gave defending powers tools. Cheap drones and coercive tactics gave challengers opportunities. Nothing in that combination guarantees tranquility. It guarantees contest. The question is whether contest can be managed tightly enough that the world still treats the corridor as governed rather than lost. That is the real standard, and that is why a single waterway can still command so much military attention in a supposedly globalized age. The answer, at least for now, is that Hormuz remains governable only through constant effort. It is not self-securing. It is not protected by market logic alone. It is not stabilized by speeches alone. It is stabilized by a continuing fusion of surveillance, escort power, logistics, command discipline, and political will. When that fusion is present, commerce can continue even after violence enters the corridor. When that fusion weakens, every tanker, every market desk, every importer, and every allied capital starts recalculating at once. That is why this waterway still controls so much of the world, not because it is large, but because it is indispensable and vulnerable at the same time.